In this video, we will break down the logistical and medical machinery behind the United States military's decision to regulate, police, and medically supervise prostitution during World War II, based on citations from Office of the Surgeon General reports, Provost Marshal records, and declassified territory files from the Pacific Theater. Let's get into it. You need to understand the battlefield before you judge the logistics. To the civilian observer, the idea of the United States Army sanctioning brothels sounds like a moral failure or a breakdown of discipline. You see the black and white photos of men lining up on Hotel Street in Honolulu, 3 deep, waiting their turn for 3 minutes of contact, and you might see debauchery. That is the view from the outside. That is the view of the moralist sitting in Washington or the church groups back on the mainland who wrote letters to the president. But to the insider, to the company commander trying to keep a rifle platoon at full strength, or the division surgeon monitoring non-battle casualty rates, those lines weren't debauchery. They were a control measure. They were a necessary evil in a calculus where the only variable that mattered was combat effectiveness. We're not here to discuss the morality of the act. We are here to discuss the maintenance of the equipment. In 1941, the equipment was the American GI, and the threat that could rust that equipment faster than salt water was venereal disease. Look at the numbers from the previous war. During World War I, the United States Army lost the equivalent of 7 full infantry divisions to venereal disease. That is not a typo in the medical logs. 7 divisions. At any given time, roughly 18,000 men were incapacitated, occupying hospital beds, consuming medical supplies, and failing to hold a rifle because they had contracted syphilis or gonorrhea. That's a tactical catastrophe. When a soldier goes down with VD, he is a casualty just as surely as if he stepped on a mine. He requires transport, he requires treatment, and he leaves a hole in the line. Entering in World War II, the high command faced a choice. They could attempt to suppress human nature and drive the sex trade underground, where infection rates were unmonitored and ravaged the ranks, or they could seize control of the industry. They chose control. This was not done out of empathy for the soldiers' loneliness. It was done with the cold logic of a mechanic fixing a leak. The military police didn't shut down the brothels in Hawaii, they guarded them. The army doctors didn't condemn the women, they inspected them. What you are about to hear is the breakdown of that system. We aren't going to sanitize the exploitation involved, and we aren't going to romanticize the liberty of the soldiers. This is a technical briefing on how the U.S. military attempted to industrialize vice to protect its investment in manpower. If you're looking for a story about romance in the Pacific, turn this off. If you want to understand how the Department of War managed the biological risks of 1 million young men deployed to a staging ground in the tropics, stay put. We are going to look at the bullpen system, the prophylactic stations, and the general orders that turned sex into a regulated supply chain. The mechanism of control was the regulated district. In the territory of Hawaii, specifically Honolulu, this wasn't a hidden alleyway operation. It was a state-sanctioned utility. Under martial law declared immediately after Pearl Harbor, the military governor, General De Los Emmons, held absolute authority. He issued general orders that effectively capped prices, set hours of operation, and mandated medical compliance. The logic was simple. containment. By concentrating the activity on Hotel Street, the provost marshal could monitor every interaction. The process was industrial. A soldier did not simply walk in, he waited in a bullpen, often for hours, corralled by military police. The time inside the room was strictly limited, often 3 to 5 minutes. This wasn't intimacy, it was a transaction speed run to maximize throughput and minimize exposure time. But the core of the mechanics wasn't the brothel itself. It was the exit strategy, the prophylactic station or pro station. To leave the district and return to barracks, a soldier had to pass through a pro station. This was not a suggestion, it was a tactical requirement. The procedure was chemically brutal. It involved a rigorous washing of the genitals with green soap, followed by the injection of protargal or a silver salt solution into the urethra, which had to be held inside for 5 minutes to cauterize potential bacteria. Finally, the application of calomel ointment, a mercury chloride compound, to the exterior. This was the chemical condom. It was painful, it was invasive, and it was mandatory. According to the official history of the United States Army Medical Department, in World War II, the effectiveness of this machinery relied entirely on the contact reporting system. Official records from the Office of the Surgeon General indicate that the military medical establishment tracked venereal contacts with the same rigor used to track malaria outbreaks. When a soldier presented with symptoms, the discharge of gonorrhea or the chancre of syphilis, he was interrogated. He had to identify the specific house and, if possible, the specific woman. The evidence of this system's scale is found in the logs of the Honolulu Police Department and the pro station intake forms. By 1942, records show that the monthly volume of customers in the Honolulu Vice District exceeded 200,000. That is not 200,000 individual soldiers, but 200,000 visits. Some facilities processed over 1,000 men in a single day. Declassified reports from the outcome of the Palmetto experiments and similar controlled device zones in the continental U.S. highlight the cold math used by the Army. Treating a soldier for syphilis in the pre-penicillin era or early penicillin era took weeks of recovery. It meant a man off the line. The cost of running a pro station and paying doctors to inspect the women weekly or daily was infinitesimal compared to the cost of losing a battalion's worth of men to the hospital wards. The files show that the military designated these women as essential to the morale of the armed forces, a classification that allowed them to travel to Hawaii even when civilian travel was restricted. They were logistical assets. The Army regulation AR 4210 specifically outlined the management of venereal disease, placing the burden of prevention squarely on the command structure. If a unit had a high VD rate, the commander was flagged for inefficiency. This created a pressure cooker where officers enforced the use of pro stations not out of morality, but to save their own careers. You are standing on Hotel Street in the midday sun. The humidity in Honolulu sits at 80%, sticking your khaki uniform to your back. The line in front of you stretches down the block, a snake of olive drab. You aren't moving. You're waiting. The air doesn't smell like ocean water or tropical flowers. It smells of stale tobacco, nervous sweat, and the distinct acrid odor of heavy disinfectant drifting from the open doorways. When you finally cross the threshold of the brothel, the experience is not one of leisure. It is an industrial process. Veterans described it as a meat grinder. You are moved through hallways lined with linoleum, stripped of any decoration that might delay the flow of traffic. The noise is a constant din of boots on wood, slamming doors, and the shouted orders of the madame or the MPs keeping the line moving. There is no courtship. You enter a room that is barely large enough for a bed and a wash basin. The sheets are changed with the efficiency of a pit crew, or sometimes just flipped. The interaction is timed. 3 minutes, maybe 5. Then a knock on the door. You are out. You are buttoning your fly as you are pushed out the back exit because the front door is for intake only. Then comes the real physical toll, the pro station. If the brothel was the factory, the pro station is the maintenance bay. You walk into a room tiled in white, smelling of chlorine and green soap. A medic, likely a board corporal, who has seen 10,000 penises that month, gestures to a sink. You wash with liquid soap that strips the oils from your skin. Then comes the injection. The medic hands you a syringe or a tube filled with a silver protonate solution, protargol or argyrol. You insert the tip into your urethra. You squeeze the plunger. The liquid burns. It is a searing chemical heat inside the most sensitive part of your anatomy. But you aren't done. You have to clamp the end of your penis shut with your fingers. You have to hold that burning liquid inside you for 5 full minutes. If you let go too early, the medic makes you do it again. You stand there, looking at a clock on the wall, counting down the seconds while your body fights the urge to expel the chemical. Finally, you release it, and then you apply the calomel ointment, a thick mercury-based grease, rubbing it into the skin for minutes until it is absorbed. You walk back to your barracks, chafing, smelling of chemicals, physically abraded by the very safety measure designed to keep you combat ready. This routine altered the behavior of the entire Pacific garrison. Fear of the disease, and specifically the consequences of contracting it, became a tactical governor on daily life. The Army operated under the line of duty determination. If you contracted a venereal disease, you were sick. But if records showed you contracted it and failed to visit a pro station, your sickness was ruled not in line of duty. This meant you were absent without leave. You lost your pay for every day you were in the hospital. You faced court-martial. You lost rank. This created a culture of paranoid vigilance. Soldiers didn't just worry about enemy fire. They worried about the short arm inspection. This was the defining ritual of the operational impact. At unannounced intervals, usually early in the morning, a company was called to formation. A medical officer would walk down the line. Each man had to drop his trousers and milk it down, squeeze the urethra to check for discharge. It stripped away privacy and reduced the soldier to a biological unit. The fear of being pulled out of line, of being the man who brought the clap into the squad, was a powerful psychological weapon used by commanders to enforce discipline. It also created a black market of silence. Men who suspected they were infected would sometimes avoid the medics, treating themselves with black market sulfa drugs if they could find them, risking severe complications rather than facing the official logbook. The safe zone of the pro station became a place of dread. The irony was palpable. The Army had made sex safe by making it chemically punishing. The threat of the Japanese Navy was abstract and over the horizon. the threat of the silver nitrate solution was immediate and physical. By late 1944, the dynamic shifted. The introduction of mass-produced penicillin turned a catastrophic tactical injury into a manageable infection. The sheer necessity of the bullpen and the chemical cauterization of the pro station began to fade as the science caught up with the biology. The military governor eventually bowed to political pressure, and the legal brothels of Hotel Street were shuttered in September 1944. But the existence of this system remains a definitive case study in the reality of total war. We often look back at World War II through a lens of distinct moral clarity, good versus evil, liberation versus tyranny. But when you examine the files of the Provost Marshal and the Surgeon General, that clarity dissolves into the gray pragmatism of survival. The United States military, faced with a biological threat that could hamstring its fighting force, did not preach abstinence. It built a factory. It treated human intimacy as a supply chain issue, regulating it with the same cold bureaucracy it applied to ammunition storage or fuel rationing. The women involved were categorized as essential utilities, their bodies inspected and stamped like issued gear. The soldiers were treated not as men with free will, but as expensive equipment that required preventative maintenance to prevent rusting. This is the unvarnished truth of the war machine. It does not pause for social niceties. It calculates the cost of a syphilis outbreak against the cost of a silver nitrate solution, and it chooses the solution every time. When you strip away the newsreels and the victory parades, you are left with the raw logic of the ledger. In the calculus of global conflict, there is no room for judgment. There is only the maintenance of the line. Thank you all for watching this video. My name is Jack, and this was my video on why the U.S. military legalized prostitution in World War II. Hope to see you in the next one.